because a lot of people are thinking about these ideas now of navigational mind. There's going to be a symposium, also a conference sort of about it. And it's more
Mm.
neuroscience related, but I could send
Mm.
you that stuff. It's a lot about propositional thought, and it's still okay. Well, thanks for being here. Thanks for doing this.
You're
It's wonderful
welcome.
to meet you. So I've heard a lot of neuroscientists talking about inventing temperature. The book you
Really?
wrote, it's been, yeah, maybe
That's
20 years
wow.
ago, right?
22 years ago now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you know this, but it's a pretty inspirational book for people in neuroscience.
No,
And
I didn't know that. I know a couple of people in neuroscience who know it, but I didn't know it was widespread at all. So what do they find useful in it?
well, I think it's because you show that something, gosh, how would I say that? That you can start with something that is felt and
Mm.
then actually get to like a felt quality can become a number that you can trust
Mm. Hmm.
scientifically.
Hmm.
Right now, a lot of our ways of doing neuroscience, we use like EEG or fMRI to talk
Yeah.
to each other, and this
Uh,
is not what you're showing happened with temperature. Also, I think there's something about the iteration, and
mm.
there's something inspiring about it to just, it's kind of messy in the story you tell in that book. It's just you never could have imagined that it would get to where it got, in a sense.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I
And
think neuroscientists find that
sometimes,
inspiring.
yeah, I see. And sometimes you don't get anywhere very nice from the mess, right? Sometimes the mess remains messy. Other times you find ways of tying things together and tidying things up so that you can get a clear enough view of where we've got to, and then you can use that little island of order as a platform to take the next step from.
Exactly. I think that's part of the inspiration too,
Yeah, yeah,
is understanding it that way, thinking of science that way, which isn't the way we necessarily learn it in school. We're
right.
supposed to follow the
Yeah,
linear path and find the answer,
that's
and if we
right.
don't, we didn't succeed, right? So it's a
Yeah,
different.
yeah. And generally, I guess, not just that book, but generally what a lot of people find at least interesting in my work is that I tend to show that the allegedly simple things in the physical sciences are really not at all simple, right? So when I hear people say, oh, biology is so complex and living systems are just messy, well, yes, but something really apparently simple is also very complex when you start looking at it seriously. So temperature was one clear example of that.
I wonder what's resonated most with you over these years, because as I see your work, you've been, so the next one, even, what is H2O, or is water H2O?
Is water H2O? That is the next one. Yeah.
Right. That's a further, well, first inventing temperature. Even that title to me
Uh-huh.
almost sounds like a paradox at first
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's
because of
right.
the way we are, which I like a lot.
Mm.
A lot of what I'm trying to figure out is how we can hold what seems like contradiction and then see it differently. And I think your book is a
Mm.
doing this. And so I wonder if that makes sense to you, and also if it feels like that book became an invitation to you. It certainly has to me and to readers to see the world and what knowledge is differently.
Mm. Yeah, certainly. Something I've said to people is that every time I write a book, I lose an article of faith. And in writing Inventing Temperature, what I wrote lost was foundationalism, right? Which I was very wedded to, right? I had this very naive notion when I was a physics student that we just find the fundamental laws of nature and then the rest of it will follow. This is the foundation of knowledge. And then you can also have a different version of foundationalism, right? Where you go more in the empiricist way. No, the foundation of everything is just experience and it has the ultimate authority and we build everything else on it. But when you go through stories like what's told in Inventing Temperature, you realize there is no ultimate authority. We just have to get on with what we've got to begin with and see our way out of that to a better place. And then when I wrote the second book, the one you just mentioned is Water H2O. Long story short, the article of faith I lost there was monism, right? This idea that there was one world, one truth, and it's the job of science to find it. So that book became quite a common reference point for people trying to think more pluralistically about science. And then with the next one, which you may or well, you must know it because you are talking about operational coherence. So the one called Realism for Realistic People. What I lost in working on that was this ideal of pure science, right? This idea that you can just have knowledge and then apply it to practical things. So that's why I more positively went into pragmatism there, right? So I think, yeah, each major research project should be a way to teach yourself how to see things differently, right? That's what I think, especially about philosophy.
It's interesting you frame it as a loss because as I read
Uh-huh.
your books, it's not a loss.
Right.
I mean, it's a reckoning, right? A
Mm.
clarity, a clarification that
Yeah. Yeah.
allows you to see things as they are without. I mean, with foundationalism, when we lose it, it seems like we've lost the foundation. But I think your movement towards movement itself, the active
Uh,
realism,
yeah.
actually, to me, it starts, to feel more like something we can trust in. It's not a foundation in a static sense because it's always moving, but
Mm.
there's something regular about it,
Mm. Yeah.
if that
Yeah.
makes
And
sense. Or at least we can see that from
I
our
think so.
position.
Yeah. And I think it's a more dynamic kind of regularity, right? It's not a regularity that's just laid down at the start. No, it's a regularity you find as you go. And I mean, I think that, what you've been telling me about concerning your work, that this attempt to understand knowledge in with a sense of movement, right? I think that that's very much in line with the way pragmatists have been thinking, which is, knowledge is something we achieve as we go on doing things. Uh, Knowledge is what crystallizes out of these coherent activities, right? But you don't start with a roadmap on how to achieve that coherence of action. No, you only learn it by twisting and turning, as I like to metaphorically, sometimes literally think of it, right? Um, so this is what I particularly appreciate about John Dewey, where he, just erases that sharp boundary between content learning and method learning, right? For him, we learn how to do things by doing them. And we learn about methods in the same process when we learn content. And I think that's a real lesson that we can take from the classical pragmatists.
I think so too, and I wonder how we'd put grounding knowledge. I'm thinking of Percy Bridgman actually a little
Oh
bit, and
yeah.
I'm wondering
Uh-huh.
when that came into your world. It seems before you got into the pragmatism, but maybe it was
Yes.
coming
Long
together.
before.
But I would
Yeah.
love to hear that because for me, it seems that you're grounding knowledge in what we do, if grounding
Mm.
is even still the right word, I don't know,
Right. Yeah.
rather than some higher reality. So I feel
Uh-huh.
Kant in you and the framing aspect. That's a really important part when you get to the mind independence and this part. I also feel that you're not we don't need the other world, the Platonic world,
Mm,
as
yeah.
part of the explanation. I guess I would like to try to better understand how that's related to how you kind of had these losses, and also how Bridgman came into your life. This kind of move into a more practical and active based way of thinking about it, which is very different from Kant, and yet I can see how maybe
Mm.
you could have gone through Kant to get there.
Right. Yeah. How I got to where I am is that's a complicated story, probably not worth anyone else's while. But Bridgman, I found literally by accident. Right. Okay, so I had heard of operationalism. I had heard his name, but nobody, I mean, Bridgman was not part of any curriculum, right? Neither in physics nor in philosophy. So operationalism is this thing that was supposed to have been rather mistakenly popular in the early 20th century and people quickly grew out of. So, that's what I just thought. But it was during the first year of my graduate school, doing my PhD in philosophy, I just happened to go to a bookstore, a used bookstore in Berkeley. I was doing my degree at Stanford, and yeah, sometimes we went to Berkeley to hang out. And at a well-known secondhand bookshop in Berkeley, I just came across literally The Logic of Modern Physics, Bridgman's first book. And I thought, oh, that's going for, I don't know, $5 or whatever. I'll just buy that because why not? And then I was reading it on the way back on the train, and it was like a revelation. And I mean, there's so many amazing things about Bridgman, but one thing that immediately popped out is how this, Nobel Prize winning experimental physicist also knew how to doubt everything, right? It's the same scale of, I don't know, resolute doubting that maybe you see at the opening of Descartes' Meditations or in bits of Wittgenstein, right? But Bridgman was doing this about really specific bits of physics, right? So, for example, he just agonizes forever about the speed of light, meaning, well, he's being inspired by Einstein, but he worries a lot about the one-way speed of light. Because when we measure the speed of light, it's always by reflecting light to something and then back, and you measure the time it takes, and you presumably know the distance. And what you do is you assume that the speed of light going there and speed of light coming back is the same. But it says, how do we know that's the same? We don't know that's the same. And that's exactly the kind of thing that Einstein taught all of us when he showed that we don't know what we're really saying when we say two events are simultaneous unless and until we specify operational procedures by which to determine that, right? Because we have the metaphysical notion that, well, if two things are happening at the same time, they're happening at the same time, whether we know it or not. And what Einstein showed in his special relativity paper of 1905 is that no, that sort of statement is meaningless unless you have a specific procedure, because depending on the specific procedure you adopt, you'll get different answers, right? So that's the origin of Einstein's whole way of thinking in special relativity. And then Einstein settles on this light beam convention, right? So when you got two points in space, you know the distance divided by half, and if the observer is in that midpoint, and if two events will happen at these two places, and at the happening of each event, a light flash would be sent out. If the light flashes arrive at the same time at the midway observer, then the events are simultaneous. Sounds like just elaborate and pointless thing to go through, but then what Einstein shows is, well, if you define it differently, you'll get different answers. Or if you are looking at now the whole thing from a different frame of reference, you'll get a different result, which is the right relativity of simultaneity. And Bridgman goes through all that, and he says when he was teaching relativity, this was a whole revelation to him. And he tells a nice story that, I mean, his work had nothing to do with modern theoretical physics. His work was in high pressure physics in the lab, which becomes relevant later. But he said, because somebody was on leave or something, his department, the physics department at Harvard, made Bridgman teach relativity. Said, okay, I will learn it and teach it. And when he read the original Einstein, he just had this shock, a conceptual shock, right? That yeah, we all had naively believed Newton when he said, oh, things like space and time are well known to all, don't need to be defined, right? Which is what he literally says in the Principia, right? And Bridgman instead says, no, 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 we have to define everything, and the best, most secure way of defining something is through the operations that we actively perform, even if those operations might be mental or what he called paper and pencil, right? Sorry to go on about that, but
Please do. I love
yeah,
this. To me,
yeah,
it says a lot about what I was saying about inventing temperature too, that
hmm
it's another thing we take for granted, so it seems like
yeah,
you can't
yeah,
have inventing in front of it.
that's right. Yeah, and I would say in a way, philosophy is the art of doubting, right? If we don't
Mhm.
doubt taken for granted things, where is the philosophy, right? Concerning the title of Inventing Temperature, you might be curious to know that that wasn't the title I had for the book.
I'm
I
not
tried
surprised.
different things. I had called it, when I sent the manuscript to the press, I had called it the philosophical thermometer, which is not a bad title. I thought it was nice. And when everything was accepted and we were about to go into the actual production, the Oxford Press editor said, we're not entirely sure about your title. What about Inventing Temperature? And I heard that and I immediately thought, that's it. That expresses precisely the kind of thing I was trying to get at. And to this day, I have no idea whether that was my commissioning editor or one of the reviewers who had that idea, but it was a good one. And when I try to explain the sense of that to people, I often say, well, you may think that invention is just making shit up, but it's not, right? An actual invention in the sense of technology only works because we design something in a way that nature allows it to work, right? So invention is not just making things up. Invention is not make believe. Invention is this very earnest engagement with nature. Nature itself, we don't know, but we learn something by learning which inventions of ours work out and which ones don't, right? So in inventing temperature, you also see many conceptual inventions as well as instrumental ones, right? Which concept of absolute temperature, for example, that William Thomson invents works out? Turns out the second one, right? Partly because it goes better with the new thermodynamic theory, partly because it just numerically agrees more with the previous standard, which was the gas thermometers. But these things, I mean, I didn't put all of that in terms of operational coherence back in 2004 when I wrote that book, but that's what it's all about, right?
Well, it seems like that to me, in the newer book, I mean, first of all, that's a more philosophical book and a kind of
Hmm.
specific sense. I mean, the
Yes.
other ones are philosophical, but it's history, it's historical, and you're
Yeah.
telling it through what's happened in history. And this one is really looking, I mean, this one is talking about the concepts and truth and reality, and
Mm.
these, you're facing the questions directly in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it seems to me that it makes inventing temperature make more sense to me.
I think that's
Or
right. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I
Mhm.
can see now you're putting words on things that you have to assume there. We have to assume there, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah. 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 So, I haven't written about this, but there was a talk I gave recently, which was about revisiting my work on measurement in terms of operational coherence. And I think that made sense to myself as well as the audience. I mean, one thing I'll add in relation to inventing is that so through all of these turns, I've come to really appreciate the perspective of conceptual engineering, as people like to talk about in some philosophical quarters these days. I don't know how much exposure you've had to that idea.
It comes up a lot more in the past year, I'd say.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think it's becoming really popular and for good reason, I think. So when you look at the kinds of stories, I'm gonna just close the window if you don't mind
Okay.
because it's
Yes, I'm
noisy
beeping.
out. Yeah. So, part of the inspiration for this conceptual engineering idea goes back to Carnap, right? His notion of explication of a concept where he says, yeah, in explication, we're not only explaining what the concept means, but we're also tidying up the concept, where we're making it more precise. We are sometimes disambiguating. We are trying to improve the concept. And then he kind of leaves it there, I think. And then the conceptual engineering people really picked that up, as well as the more socially oriented strand of work coming from Stanley Haslanger and others on race and gender and such concepts. Anyway, so the conceptual engineering point of view, I think, can really give a more active sense of what we do in philosophy, right? We're not just doing analysis. We are trying to make our concepts more fit for purpose. And then it also makes you think, well, what is the purpose? Because we often can get into this way of regarding philosophy as a realm of eternal truths and meaning, and we don't think about why we do philosophy, why we are trying to solve certain philosophical problems. But when you shift your gaze back onto science, I think it's very obvious that scientists have always been conceptual engineers. Right? What is science except continually inventing better ways of thinking, new concepts, refinement of old concepts, and scientific concepts are put to certain purposes. Again, scientists may forget that as well, but we may invent concepts for calculations or explanations or certain applications or connection with other fields. There are these, right, particular epistemic aims that um, we are trying to achieve by means of these concepts. So this also puts a whole new spin on the idea of instrumentalism, right? Which is usually just seen as not very exciting opposite of realism. But the idea that concepts are tools, theories are tools, and we're going to do things with them, I think that's really exciting.
I think it's very exciting too, and it's interesting you use the word inventing there
Mm,
with the concepts. And you also are, a philosopher of history. And I think the historical aspect is actually very important too, because
Mm,
as you explained with inventing, it's not that we're just coming up with stuff out of nowhere
right. Yeah.
randomly. So also, I think it would probably be too long of a diversion, but the way it relates to language itself, I mean, you brought up
Mm,
Carnap, and there's also some confusion there that I would like to see dealt with about how much, it has to do with propositional knowledge too,
mm,
actually, and how much of that is actually about conceptual engineering in the sense of language.
mm,
But either way, even if we think of it in a wider active realist sense, or we think of it in a more propositional kind of traditional sense, there is a historical aspect, right, to it. There is a kind of, which
mm.
actually has a lot to do with how we're going to use it in the moment that we're
Yeah.
using it,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
feels
Yeah.
important. And so I'm bringing that up because a lot of what we've been discussing, it still sounds like everything's just sort of floating, or there's no. I feel with the active realism and the operational coherence that this is something that takes that historical aspect to heart and gives us
Mm,
a way. As you were describing the Einstein, for example, that we could start to maybe see from different perspectives, and also understand that the whole is a whole, is real, is connected. That's been a very, very hard tension for us to hold in philosophy and science.
mm.
And you address this, I think, very much in your books through what's a way to think of it? Truth is correspondence, perhaps, and how you've eased, can I say, eased into operational coherence
Yeah.
instead.
Uh,
Does that make any sense to you? Do you see what I'm trying to unpack, which I think is something in your work that's very important, that doesn't
mm.
fit into instrumentalism or
Right.
conceptual
Yeah.
engineering?
Yeah. Or I would hope that instrumentalism or conceptual engineering can also rise to meet this kind of,
It's
yeah.
not in those as we
Mm,
typically think of them,
right.
is what I'm
Right.
saying. I think it
Yeah.
could add something and
Yeah.
expand so that we don't have to choose
Mm,
between, but there's something you're
right.
offering that isn't in that conception,
Yeah.
as I've
Uh-huh.
read at least yet,
I see.
but I haven't
Yeah.
read everything.
I think, I mean, your emphasis on history is really important. And a big part of my methodological work is worrying about how to bring the history and the philosophy of science together, but we won't go into that right now. Um, I mean, at the end of the abstract of yours that you shared with me, you mentioned epistemic iteration again. And I think that's quite important. Um, Now, I didn't realize this when I was writing Inventing Temperature. I thought epistemic iteration was just the way in which this particular problem of the validation of measurement standards was solved. And I thought, okay, it could have more um, general applicability, but I left it at that. And in the years since then, I just keep seeing it in other people's work and in my own as well. Oh, yeah. Uh, and what I've come to realize is that there is something very general about that iterative pattern of development, right? Because whenever we're trying to go from nowhere to somewhere, well, not nowhere, but some very imperfect starting point to something better, how else would it work out, right? Other than to start from what we are given. And this is not the sense of the given, as traditional epistemologists talk about. No, what we're given in the sense of what we've inherited historically, um, what our constraints are biologically, what we have learned so far in the specific knowledge of the fields that we work in. So these are the starting points that it doesn't make any sense to try to escape, right? So we're going to start with what we're given, and then we're going to find some clever ways of learning something that will allow us to come back to the starting point and improve it. So when you look at the very process of learning and inquiry in this way, then it becomes really important that history is part of what we are trying to achieve. Because without history, this whole process doesn't make any sense, has no place to exist in. So history is not just curious facts about the past. History is not just incidental to what we've achieved. This path dependence of progress is essential to the kind of progress that we have achieved. I think that's the point.
Very well said. The path dependence is exactly the right term, I think, too. I mean, at least for me. But I was also thinking as you were talking that Is Water H2O starts to talk about systems of practice, which is actually a sort of step towards
Yes.
operational coherence, isn't it?
Mm.
It's like
Mm.
turning anti-foundationalism into what you talk about as a stance. And
Yes.
I
Yeah.
believe that's where you start to develop the active realism, right? Do I remember that correctly? That
That
there's this
is
sort
right.
of,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah. There's some terminological difficulties because I've been making up the terminology as I went along as my thoughts developed. So
Mm-hmm.
um, that's why in the recent book I relabeled my brand of realism as activist realism, um,
Yeah. I ask you about
because
that. It's interesting.
yeah. So what I meant by active realism in already in Is Water H2O is a sense that scientific realism shouldn't just be a matter of sitting back and being satisfied that we know so much or know something so well. But no, it should be an attitude, an outlook on life, and even an ideology which is committed to learning more and more and more, more and better all the time, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
because in the um, Realism for Realistic People book, I used the phrase active knowledge to indicate, roughly speaking, knowing how. I didn't want active realism to be confused with that, because someone might think, oh, active realism is just any assured possession of active knowledge. No, it's not that. And so that's why I changed
Mm,
that to
okay.
activist to indicate more clearly the sense that no, what we want is this ever learning attitude, rather than shrinking so that we preserve what we think we already know. So that's the terminology uh, that had to be changed a bit. But yeah, I think the sense of
Well,
active realism as given in Is H2O, Is Water H2O is still there.
yeah, it's still there. And I think maybe this is a point where you could tell me a bit about the correspondence, because as I see it over this time, realism isn't
Hmm.
about correspondence.
Right.
It's about an activity. And that's a big difference, right? Um,
Hmm.
Especially when we think of it through traditional ways of thinking about knowledge, or we could talk about it through active knowledge, maybe.
Hmm.
So, in a way, that's what the people in inventing temperature are doing. Um,
Yeah.
and they're not just finding these pre-given things or whatever. They're constructing a system that kind of
Right.
keeps helping them understand things better. It's
Yes.
so in a
Yeah.
way, I mean, this is hard to talk about, but for me, it did like think about active knowledge. It's not that we don't find what is true in each moment from each position, but because we are, it is real, and because we are all part of it, it's going to change too. So it's like somehow finding ways we can measure that accurately
Hmm.
through the regularities that don't change somehow. I don't know if I know
Hmm.
that's a very complicated way to say it, and I'm sort of putting in my own work, but I think what I'm really interested in is if you could tell me a little bit about how you got from the correspondence to,
Hmm.
or how to think about active knowledge, that we don't need the correspondence.
Right. So there are two. Right. That's a very
It's I know
complicated
this is
set of
messy. Yeah.
issues, but Right. There are two things to say concerning correspondence. One is, even if we're talking about propositional knowledge, I'm trying to get away from the standard correspondence view of truth concerning the propositions. Traditional in the sense of thinking in terms of correspondence between whatever our propositions or theories say and how the Platonic world out there is, right? Because it's a common complaint that correspondence is never checkable.
Right.
And the
And
question
I'm
about,
sorry to
yeah.
interrupt you, but just
Hmm.
for listeners too, in a way, this is what science has kind of assumed, that we're going to find these things that are then always going to be true
Right. I mean,
in a very general sense.
yeah, I think that's how scientists often think. But if you actually look at their practice, yeah, they're
That's not
always
true.
checking the correspondence of things. But what are we checking? We're checking the correspondence between two things that are both accessible when we're doing science or engaging in everyday activities, right? So if we are painting something in the sort of naive realist way of painting. We're going to have a view of the object as I see it, and we're going to have a view of the object as I paint it. And we're going to compare the two to see, oh, I've drawn that quite well, whatever. But there's no question of checking the correspondence of anything to the inaccessible reality that metaphysical realists or Platonists like to think in terms of. So there's always checking for correspondence, but that's a mundane activity. Checking, yeah, the predictions of our models with things we observe in the lab, right? Checking the predictions of the positions of stars with what actually comes to be tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. Right. So these both sides of this correspondence relation are accessible. So one thing I've been trying to achieve concerning correspondence is right regarding propositional knowledge, bringing that down to earth, as it were. Right. Correspondence is here and now. We know how to check these things. We're not talking about um, the correspondence between phenomena and noumena. That's not the business of science, right? So that's one side of it. The other side is, yeah, when we go into knowing how, or what I'm calling active knowledge, the whole place of correspondence kind of evaporates when you're thinking about knowledge like that. And that's how a lot of my thinking about pragmatism started, because I was just really finding the standard proposition-based epistemology not useful when I was thinking about how scientific practices develop and how do we evaluate things like the quality of methodologies, instruments, scientific institutions, even, right? So there's this whole other dimension of doing in knowing, and a proposition corresponding to anything isn't really going to get us far enough. So that's the bigger way in which I started departing from correspondence. But, you know, when you say, how do we evaluate the quality of propositional knowledge, at least in principle, we say, right, we want to know if the propositions are true or not. But when we are asking about the quality of active knowledge, that answer isn't going to cut it, right? Which is why I started instead thinking about the operational coherence of what we do. So instead of the truth of propositions, we're going to think about the coherence of actions. And yeah, when you're thinking like that, then correspondence really only enters in a very peripheral way into the whole notion of the quality of knowledge.
Right, because often one thing that is kind of this is all measured against is how do we know we're progressing or how do we know we're getting
Yeah,
better?
yeah,
And I think your artwork example is very interesting because then there's a way which we've just been comparing. Does it look like this?
yeah,
More like this? But
yeah,
instead, you can switch it to as I'm actively because we don't ever stop creating this artwork that we're talking about.
right,
It's not ever done, and
yeah,
the artwork itself is always changing. So instead, it becomes about it's like you're trying to paint that's alive, right?
mm,
You're trying to paint
mm,
a scene.
yeah,
And so it's always going to be changing. So how do you now think
yeah,
about are you progressing? Well, as you show, you can just is each iteration to use that word achieving more coherence. To
mm,
me, it's just a different. It's like we've shifted how we're
yeah.
considering it, and it's very helpful. It's incredibly helpful, actually.
I
Instead
hope
of
so. Yeah,
thinking of there's a static thing there that I then have to
right.
find and replicate, which I think we
Yeah.
all sort of know now that's not really the way whatever we're doing is
Uh,
gonna work.
and it's certainly not how modern people think about art, right?
No,
And
right.
what that shows. So, when we have the naive view of art as reproduction of what we see, um, something we don't think about when we think like that is the question of purpose, right? Why are we doing art? Because in that way of thinking, it's taken for granted that the purpose of drawing or painting is to, yeah, reproduce the shape that we see. But that's, something that we've completely left behind in the world of art, right? So likewise in science, what we have to ask, what is the purpose of the activities that we're carrying out? And the work of people like Ian Hacking were very useful and influential for this, right? Because, I mean, they take the very title of his famous book, Representing and Intervening. Already there's two wholly different kinds of things that scientists do. And then if you look at his chapter on observation, chapter on experiment, yeah, he points out we do experiments for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes the creation of new phenomena is a goal in itself. Sometimes we do experiments to test theories. Sometimes we do experiments just in order to get a clearer picture of what kind of phenomena there is. So there are all kinds of different reasons for doing experiments. Same with theory, same with anything else we do in science. So I think the one thing I was trying to achieve with my talk of operational coherence is to bring the question of aims explicitly into the center of the picture, because coherence, as you've seen, is only defined with respect to an aim, right? Without an aim that's articulated or at least assumed, the talk of coherence makes no sense. So that's what I
This is what
was,
I love. Yeah, I love
yeah.
this, and I think there's a way of doing science that needs to open up and take all of that into consideration, instead of,
Mhm.
for example, in neuroscience where we're doing stimulus
Right.
response.
Yeah. Yes.
It's a lot more like the comparing of the artwork example you first gave, and
Uh-huh.
to do that, however, we really need these new ways of thinking about it, which I think you are offering. And it's also, I mean, I started this as research conversations, but I published it under this title, Love and Philosophy, which makes
Mhm.
people cringe a bit in science because on purpose, because we're not
Yeah.
supposed to talk about care and love. And for
Right.
me, I was just kind of, um, I think this has to do with what we care about in the moment.
Mm.
But the reason I bring that up is because I talked to Philip Ball. I don't know if you've read his work, but he's
Yeah.
talking about
Yeah.
biology through
Uh-huh.
meaning and aim in a
Right.
way that
Right.
resonated with what you were just saying. And
Uh-huh.
I think a lot of people want to do that because we clearly those things are important and like the purpose, the meaning, the aim. But we've often been told we shouldn't use those words or think through
Right.
those. And so I see this sort of new frameworks like operational coherence and thinking of knowledge as active. For me, that gives us a rigorous way to start to do that, which doesn't have to fall into mystical kind of
Right.
patterns.
Yeah, yeah,
You can
yeah,
be
yeah.
mystical, but I mean, it just,
That's
you're
right.
still
Yeah.
doing science. And
Yeah.
it's like you have to be more rigorous because you have to say what position
Mm.
towards what
Mm.
aim in what
Mm. Mm.
context rather than
Mm.
have all that assumed, which it is right now. I don't know if that makes sense to you. To me, it
Uh,
feels like what you're showing with your books, all your books, actually.
mm.
That's what I mean by the historical part too. It's getting more
Yeah.
rigorous in terms of how we understand what we're doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think people often have a very narrow notion of what rigor means, right? And, you know, rigorous for what purpose, in what way? That's the question. When we talk about progress, it's the same. When we say we've made progress, that doesn't mean anything unless we specify what have we got better at and to what end. So that
Yeah,
this,
and from what position?
yeah, 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 yeah. The whole philosophical debate on scientific progress, um, there was a way in which I don't want to say it was a waste of time, but there's a sense of futility to the traditional debate people had about progress. And, I think people like Kuhn did start opening that up when he talked about the different competing values that scientists have. But then after all that, he wanted to bring it back down to problem solving ability. He didn't quite say why problem solving ability was the most important thing about science. And I think he would have just said, well, it just is. And at that point, he would have retreated to his position that he was just descriptively telling you what scientists do, not trying to dictate what they should do. But I think there was a very fine line he was trying to walk between the descriptive and the normative. And in the end, I think he was saying, look, science as we know it is great. So, right, if we
Mhm.
describe how that great enterprise works out, then we're saying what is actually good. So it's a hidden normativity behind the surface descriptivity of his enterprise.
It would be too much, but even getting past the either or of those
Mm.
words, I feel like
Yeah.
he with paradigm and he was opening up beyond that, but I think
Yes.
it's very hard for us to do that. And
Mm.
so, for example, his work even, it starts getting lumped into one side. So maybe
Yeah.
some of
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
pushback, to bring it back
Oh
to
yeah,
the
yeah,
other side. At
absolutely.
least that's
Yeah,
how I've read it.
yeah. And that's one of the reasons why, I mean, I've been very strongly inspired by Kuhn. Um, but this is why I didn't want to use the paradigm concept because I thought it just had accumulated too much baggage in all kinds of directions. And with my talk of epistemic activities and operational coherence, I wanted to put aims at the center in an explicit way so we don't ever forget about them.
I think that's so important. And also the way you're telling what I think of as the real story of pragmatism, because that's another thing that's gotten.
That's a whole other issue. Yes.
I mean, it
Yeah.
depends where you are. It depends on what position.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people have loved it forever and they get it, but at different points of analytic philosophy or neuroscience, it seemed something else. But
Mm.
that would be another discussion. But I do think that's what's important. And that, again, that has to do with that historical aspect of seeing
Hmm.
this in a context and seeing that we have to see the context each
Yes.
time. We don't
Oh,
just
yeah.
assume there's one context that always applies.
That's right.
That's
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
hard thing. I was going to ask you before, in a very kind of general way, about
Mhm.
how you start with sensation or feeling. There's a lot of different ways to use those words in
Yeah.
neuroscience and psychology, but
Right.
in inventing temperature, it's hot or cold, right? And then we get to temperature. I mean, that's really way
Oh.
overly condensed, but I'm
That's
thinking,
chapter one. Yes.
yeah, but you don't leave it behind necessarily, the feeling part of
No,
it.
no, no, you never
Um,
leave it behind. Yeah,
no,
yeah.
it's always part of it. But when I'm thinking about something like mind or
Uh-huh.
consciousness, those words are a little different than the
Mm.
hot cold, right?
Oh yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
yet, I mean, in terms of trying to think about this through the sort of frameworks that you've presented, because it's
Mm.
very helpful, but then at a point it starts to feel like we are like subjective experience itself is the target in a way.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And there's not going to be like a ladder to kind of
Right.
kick away or whatever.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
I had this thing like, could there be an inventing mind way of thinking about this, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess some people would want that, right? I mean, all these post-humanists and such would just think our mind was just an accidental step along the way to the
Oh,
great.
I really
Yeah, yeah.
don't mean it like that though, because
No,
temperature,
I know.
yeah.
But
I guess that's exactly the difficulty though. I
uh-huh,
wouldn't want it to be taken that way, but there's a way, I guess it's more of almost linguistic, and
uh-huh.
temperature is more of a measurement that's not linguistic. I don't-
Mm. But I think, I mean, something you said a minute ago, I think is very important. Namely that with the science of mind, I mean, it's always gonna be about subject experience in some way, right? I think it has to be.
Mhm.
With temperature, thermal physics isn't really about our bodily experience of hot and cold, right? So I think the kind of neuroscience and related fields you're working in is more like, it's not like thermal physics, but it would be more like the physiology of temperature, right? Then
Physiology.
you would never want to leave behind the human experience.
Hmm.
But I think, yeah, when it comes to thermal physics, uh, the scientists really want to leave the human origins of this behind, and they can to a large extent. I don't think they can entirely, but um, so it's like another example, parallel would be optics, right? So if you're doing lasers and whatever, yeah, you can leave behind the visual experience that humans first got started with. But suppose you're doing the science of colors, then it wouldn't make any sense to leave behind human experience, right? So
Hmm. Yeah, exactly.
I tend to think that neuroscience or psychology is like the science of colors. It's not going to mean anything if you just leave behind the human experience that got it all started.
I agree, and that's why I'm trying to kind of pick up that whole scaffold and shift it a bit in the sense
Ah,
of thinking about mind as a bodily action.
right. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
if it already is a bodily action, you can't
Yeah.
leave the
Hmm.
body behind. You can have
Right.
many
Yeah.
different, I mean,
Yeah.
many different kinds of bodies, whether it's an insect or
Yes.
a dog or a
Mm,
person would have a different bodily
yeah.
action that is mind. But
Yeah.
then what happens, and we'll maybe have to talk about this later because I'm too excited, but I have to go. And then
Yeah.
what happens when I'm using your work is that it's almost a meta application
Hmm.
because I'm
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
then applying the coherence to those different operational systems that
Hmm.
would be
Yeah.
the bodily motion in context with
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
aim.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Does that make sense? Yeah.
next time we talk,
Okay.
I'd love to hear much more about that and
Okay.
how you're trying to navigate through
Okay.
those
Well,
treacherous waters.
that would be wonderful, and I just wanna express my appreciation to you. I don't mean to flatter you, but I really the moment you described, finding the book in Berkeley and being on the train, I've
Oh
had a
yeah.
kind of moment like that, and who knows why this happens, but, a lot of what you're doing, it's putting words on things that I think a lot of people are trying to understand. So I just wanna say thanks, and thanks for spending time
Oh,
with me,
thank you. I
and,
appreciate that.
Yeah, good luck with all your stuff. That talk you mentioned what isn't recorded, I guess, the one about relating operational coherence to inventing temperature.
Oh, I'll have to ask the organizers whether it was recorded. I don't think it was. I'll be happy to share the slides with you if that would be
I'd love to see
interesting.
that. Yeah, because I
Okay.
feel like the meta thing I described has to
Yeah,
do
yeah,
with that
yeah.
iteration.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll send
Well,
that
till
to you
next
when
time
I
then.
log off. Okay.
Okay,
Very
thanks
good
so
to meet
much.
you, Andrea. Yeah.
Very good to meet you, and
See
thanks so
you
much for the time.
again another time. Yeah.
See you
Okay.
soon. Bye.
Yeah. Take care. Bye.
Be well.